Japan made a move that Moscow did not see coming, and it didn't require a single soldier crossing a border. For more than 3 years, the war in Ukraine has been grinding through phases that analysts keep labeling as turning points. But what is unfolding now is different in character. It is quieter, more technical, and in many ways more consequential than another artillery exchange or another repositioning of frontline forces. The shift happening right now is happening in laboratories, in boardrooms, in bilateral meetings conducted with careful diplomatic language, and at the center of it is a country that has, for most of the post-World War II era, kept its distance from exactly this kind of entanglement. Japan is moving, and the nature of that movement is starting to register as a strategic variable that was absent from most calculations about where this conflict goes next. This is not about Japan sending troops. That is not what is happening, and framing it that way would miss the point entirely. What Japan is doing is more subtle and, over time, potentially more durable. It is investing in the architecture of Ukrainian defense capacity, the technological, industrial, and knowledge transfer layer that determines not just how a country fights today, but how it sustains itself under pressure for years ahead. And within that broader shift, one specific area of cooperation has begun to draw serious attention from defense analysts and geopolitical observers alike: unmanned aerial systems, specifically the development of counter-drone technology built around speed, cost efficiency, and a degree of autonomous capability that represents a genuine evolution in how aerial threats are managed on a modern battlefield. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the problem it is trying to solve, because the problem itself has been reshaping the conflict in ways that are not always visible in daily headlines. Since the early phases of the full-scale invasion that began in February 2022, drone warfare has accelerated in sophistication and scale at a pace that surprised even well-resourced military establishments. What started as a relatively limited use of commercial and military-grade unmanned systems has expanded into something that now defines the operational rhythm of the conflict. Russian forces have deployed long-range attack drones, most prominently the Shahed series loitering munitions, produced with Iranian design assistance in large numbers, often launching them in coordinated waves designed not just to strike specific infrastructure, but to exhaust Ukrainian air defense resources. The logic is deliberately economic. Each interceptor missile used to neutralize an incoming drone costs far more than the drone itself. When that asymmetry holds consistently, the side under attack faces a slow-motion resource drain that no amount of tactical resolve can fully offset. Ukraine's air defense network has performed with remarkable effectiveness given the scale of what it has been asked to absorb. Western-supplied systems, Patriot batteries, NASAMS platforms, older Soviet-era equipment kept operational through improvisation and battlefield ingenuity, have intercepted an extraordinary proportion of incoming threats, but extraordinary proportion is not all of them. And the infrastructure that has been struck, power grids, heating systems, water treatment facilities, civilian housing, has imposed a human cost that goes beyond what casualty statistics capture. More pressingly, every interceptor missile expended is a missile that has to be replaced, and the production and supply pipelines for those systems, while functioning, are not infinite. This is the strategic environment in which the Japan-Ukraine technology partnership has begun to take shape. The problem being addressed is not abstract. It is a concrete cost exchange dilemma. How do you intercept a large volume of relatively low-cost threats without spending yourself into a position where your defense capacity degrades faster than your ability to replenish it? The answer that has been gaining traction, and that Japanese technology investment has been helping to develop, involves interceptor drones, not missiles. Drones designed specifically to detect, track, and neutralize other drones. The concept is not new in theoretical discussions of counter-unmanned aerial system warfare, but translating it from theory into a reliable, scalable operational capability is an entirely different challenge. The systems currently being explored and developed through Japan-Ukraine collaboration are centered on several key performance criteria. They need to be fast enough to intercept maneuvering targets, inexpensive enough to deploy in the numbers required to respond to swarm-style attacks, and capable of operating with sufficient autonomy to function effectively in an electronically contested environment where human-in-the-loop control becomes unreliable. That last point is worth pausing on. Electronic warfare, the jamming of communication signals, the disruption of GPS navigation, the interference with remote control systems, has been a defining feature of the conflict in Ukraine in ways that rarely make headlines, but profoundly shape what works and what doesn't on the battlefield. Systems that depend heavily on real-time data links between operator and platform become vulnerable the moment that link is degraded or severed. The development of interceptor drones capable of executing their mission with a meaningful degree of autonomous functionality is therefore not simply a performance enhancement, it is a direct response to the actual operating conditions of this conflict, conditions that have been stress testing every assumption about how unmanned systems behave in high-intensity, electronically contested environments. Japanese companies entering this space bring something that is genuinely difficult to replicate quickly: manufacturing precision, miniaturization expertise, and integrated systems engineering developed over decades in consumer electronics, automotive robotics, and industrial automation. These are not directly military industries, but the technical competencies they produce transfer in ways that matter enormously when the challenge is building reliable, cost-effective unmanned systems at scale. Japanese firms have deep experience with sensor fusion, real-time signal processing, battery optimization, and the kind of quality control standards that mean a system behaves predictably in conditions it wasn't explicitly designed for. That is exactly the profile of capability that complements what Ukrainian engineers and operators bring to the collaboration: real-world battlefield experience, an intimate understanding of what actually fails under operational conditions, and an urgency that accelerates development cycles in ways that peacetime procurement systems simply cannot replicate. The partnership model that has emerged is therefore genuinely novel. This is not the transfer of finished weapons systems, it is a co-development relationship in which Ukrainian operational insight and Japanese technical depth are being combined to produce solutions that neither side could develop as effectively working alone. Ukrainian startups, many of which have emerged directly from the war itself, founded by engineers and veterans who identified specific capability gaps and decided to address them, have been establishing connections with Japanese counterparts through a combination of government-facilitated introductions and direct commercial outreach. The result is a collaborative structure that sits somewhere between defense procurement, commercial technology partnership, and knowledge exchange, and it is this hybrid character that makes it significant beyond the immediate military application. Japan's willingness to engage in this kind of partnership represents a genuine shift in its foreign policy posture. For decades, Japan's Article 9 constitutional constraints and its carefully maintained position of strategic restraint shaped a foreign policy defined by what Japan would not do as much as what it would. Arms exports were effectively prohibited. Military cooperation with countries outside the US-Japan alliance framework was minimal. Japan participated in international security discussions, contributed to peacekeeping operations, and maintained one of the world's most capable self-defense forces. But the active projection of Japanese technological and strategic capability into an active conflict zone, even through the indirect mechanism of corporate partnership and technology co-development, would have been politically unthinkable not long ago. What changed is not any single decision or any single event. It is the accumulation of strategic pressure that has been reshaping Japanese security thinking since at least 2022. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine arrived as a geopolitical shock that resonated in Tokyo in ways that were specific to Japan's own threat environment. Japan watches a China that has been explicit about its ambitions regarding Taiwan, a North Korea whose missile program has been advancing rapidly and provocatively, and a Russia whose willingness to use force to revise territorial arrangements by military means has now been demonstrated in Europe. Japanese strategic planners looking at that environment and concluding that passive restraint is no longer an adequate posture are not overreacting. They are reading a changed landscape accurately. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's government moved in 2022 to revise Japan's national security strategy in ways that were described at the time as the most significant shift in Japanese defense policy since the end of World War II. Defense spending was put on a trajectory toward 2% of GDP, a benchmark that carries symbolic weight in NATO contexts and that signals a fundamental change in how Japan is willing to resource its security commitments. Export control rules were modified to allow Japan to transfer defense equipment under certain conditions, and the diplomatic space for Japan to engage with countries like Ukraine, not as a combatant, not as a party to the conflict, but as a technology partner and economic supporter, opened in ways that would not have been politically feasible 5 years earlier. The financial dimension of the relationship deserves its own attention. Japan has committed substantial aid to Ukraine through multilateral channels and direct bilateral support, contributions that have included budgetary assistance, humanitarian aid, and infrastructure reconstruction funding. But the technology partnership being built through corporate collaboration represents something different. It is creating economic entanglement, institutional relationships, and shared development pathways that will persist beyond the immediate crisis. When a Japanese company and a Ukrainian startup jointly develop a counter-drone system, they are not just solving today's tactical problem, they are building a business relationship, a shared intellectual property base, and a mutual interest in the continued development and commercialization of that technology. That kind of durable connection shapes the strategic relationship between countries in ways that formal diplomatic statements rarely capture. This is the dimension that introduces new complexity into the calculations of those watching from Moscow. Russia's approach to the conflict has been premised on a set of assumptions about Ukraine's capacity for self-sufficiency, about Western attention span, and about the willingness of more distant actors to accept the costs and risks of sustained engagement. The entry of Japan as a meaningful participant in Ukrainian defense technology development challenges all three of those assumptions simultaneously. It signals that Ukrainian technological capacity has attracted serious partners beyond the immediate Euro-Atlantic circle. It introduces a source of investment and innovation that does not carry the domestic political constraints that sometimes complicate decision-making in European capitals. And it suggests that the strategic calculus in Tokyo has shifted to the point where the risks of deeper engagement are now assessed as lower than the risks of continued restraint. That last point carries weight that extends beyond Ukraine specifically. Japan's engagement is being watched closely in Taipei, in Seoul, in Canberra, capitals that are asking their own questions about how the international order is being renegotiated and what their own posture should be in an environment where established assumptions about strategic stability can no longer be taken for granted. The partnerships being built between Japan and Ukraine are providing a template, or at least a data point, for how democratic nations with significant technological capacity can contribute to collective security without crossing the formal threshold of direct military involvement. Whether that template holds, whether it produces the capabilities it is intended to produce, and whether it shifts the operational dynamics of the conflict in measurable ways, those remain open questions that the current state of development does not yet answer definitively. The counter-drone technology itself is still maturing. It is important to be precise about this. The systems being co-developed are not operational at scale as of this writing. The technical challenges involved in building interceptor drones that perform reliably in the actual conditions of this conflict, dense electronic warfare environments, unpredictable weather, rapidly evolving threat profiles, are significant and not trivial to overcome. The history of defense technology development is full of promising concepts that encountered unexpected obstacles when tested against real-world conditions. The collaboration between Japanese firms and Ukrainian developers is producing genuine progress, according to available reporting and industry observations, but characterizing that progress as a solved problem would be inaccurate and irresponsible. What can be said with confidence is that the direction of development is coherent with the operational need, that the partnership structure is one that combines the right kinds of complementary expertise, and that the economic logic of cost-competitive counter-drone capability is sound. The asymmetric cost exchange that makes mass drone attacks strategically attractive for the attacker only holds as long as the defender cannot intercept at comparable cost. If interceptor drones can be produced and deployed at a per-unit cost that approaches the cost of the threats they are designed to counter, the strategic logic shifts. The attacker can no longer assume that sustained pressure will gradually exhaust the defender's resources faster than they can be replenished. That is not a trivial change in the operational environment. It is the kind of shift that, if achieved at scale, would require the attacking party to fundamentally reassess the value of its current approach. This is why the framing of this story as raising tensions is precise rather than dramatic. The tensions being raised are not the product of inflammatory rhetoric or calculated provocation. They are the product of a genuine change in the strategic landscape, one that introduces new uncertainty into calculations that were previously more stable. From the perspective of those prosecuting the conflict on one side, the emergence of a technologically sophisticated new partner on the other side represents exactly the kind of development that long-term attrition strategies are designed to prevent. The goal of such strategies is to make the cost of sustained resistance prohibitive, to ensure that external support remains limited enough that the defender's capacity gradually erodes. A Japan-Ukraine technology partnership that begins to close the cost exchange gap on drone interception does not fit that model. It represents the kind of external variable that can change the terminal calculus of a conflict, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow compounding way that strategic shifts actually tend to occur. Several signals are worth watching as this situation continues to develop. The first is the pace of deployment and operational testing of the interceptor systems being developed. Reports of field testing, modifications based on battlefield feedback, and initial deployment announcements, should they occur, would indicate that the development timeline is advancing faster than even optimistic projections suggest. The second is the response of Russian electronic warfare doctrine to this class of threat. If interceptor drones that can operate autonomously begin to demonstrate effectiveness, the likely counter-adaptation involves more sophisticated signal environment manipulation, physical countermeasures, and adjustments to attack drone trajectories and flight profiles. The nature of those adaptations, as they become observable, will tell analysts a great deal about how seriously the capability is being taken. The third signal is diplomatic and financial. The degree to which other nations with advanced technology sectors begin to follow the partnership model that Japan and Ukraine are developing. South Korea, Taiwan, and several European nations have their own reasons to observe this collaboration carefully and their own potential contributions to offer. If the Japan-Ukraine model begins to attract additional participants, the scope of technological investment in Ukrainian defense capacity expands in ways that would significantly alter the medium-term outlook. And the fourth signal is within Japan itself, whether the domestic political consensus that has enabled this shift in posture holds, deepens, or encounters resistance as the costs and risks of deeper engagement become more tangible. What has already changed, regardless of how those signals develop, is the set of assumptions on which certain strategic calculations were based. Japan's entry into this space, measured, technically focused, operating through the mechanisms of corporate partnership and bilateral technology cooperation, rather than direct military involvement, represents a meaningful expansion of the network of capable, committed actors invested in Ukrainian resilience. It was not anticipated in the scenario planning that shaped the current phase of the conflict, and the fact that it was not anticipated is itself part of the story. Strategic surprises, in the context of protracted conflict, rarely arrive as dramatic single events. They arrive as the cumulative effect of decisions made in quieter rooms, over longer timelines, by actors who did not feature prominently in the original strategic map. Japan did not appear in that map as a significant variable. That is no longer the case. The situation is now more complex than it was 12 months ago, and that complexity is not evenly distributed. One side of this conflict has seen its operational assumptions complicated by a development it did not engineer and cannot easily neutralize. The other has gained a partner whose technological depth, financial capacity, and strategic motivation to be part of this story are not going to dissipate. The partnership is still early, the technology is still developing, the outcomes are not yet written, but the direction is established, and the consequences of that direction are beginning to become visible to those paying close attention. That is what makes this moment worth understanding, not as a dramatic turning point, but as the kind of structural shift that defines how high-stakes competitions actually evolve, not in a single explosion, but in the quiet, persistent accumulation of capability, partnership, and resolve. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.